So I've actually sort of wrestled with this question like my entire life, just because sacred art is such like a big part of my life, you know, being an artist. And so I've always asked the question, why? Because I've always been presented this sort of idea of, you know, if God can, you know, speak to anybody anywhere, and, you know, nobody's seen him anyway, and the only thing we've really seen is Jesus, and his message is like all we really need, then why should I even make art? Because I've always felt like, well, I've always been told, I haven't always felt like, but I've always been told, like, you know, you don't need images. And so that's always sort of made me feel obsolete, like, okay, so why even do the art then? And so I think it's interesting for me how art and religion, or art and belief, is always sort of tied together. They're like these societal sort of images that you get. So we're going to do something fun. So I'm going to put a word on the board, and I want like one person to just like tell me like their description of that thing, like that idea, okay? Angels. What is the first, most stereotypical image of angels that you think of?
Wings.
Wings, yeah.
Halo.
Huh?
Halo.
Halos. Anybody else?
Long white dresses. Like
Yep.
Dress, yeah.
It's interesting because you usually see that. That is the picture of angels we see. And the funny thing is that angels, whenever children draw angels, they usually always draw angels as women. And they always draw houses as colonial houses. And it's weird. Like, it's weird. And there's a reason for that. Like, in our thinking, in our Western thinking, this comes from Leonardo da Vinci. Leonardo da Vinci did a lot of studies in his art about what is beauty. Because beauty is objective, but then he believed, you know, because of God, there should be ultimate beauty. So what is it? And a lot of his artwork, you probably see it in like the Last Supper, or like a lot of the Madonnas that he did, like the Mary and Jesus paintings that he did. He sort of put in this idea that things that are more feminine are more beautiful, and then things that are more masculine are more, like, for lack of a better word, ugly. And so in a lot of his pictures, and this actually continues in the Catholic Church today, so like you'll see pictures of Jesus, and he's very, Jesus in the Catholic Church, I like Catholics, but Jesus looks like a wimp in a lot of Catholic art, and he's very like soft, and he has long flowing hair, and a lot of the disciples will look very, very like almost womanly, and then all of the evil people like the devil or the Romans or stuff like that, they'll look like really ugly and aggressive. And so angels are usually look like that. I don't know where the stars come from. I don't know where the stars came from, but I think it has to do with, has anybody seen like It's a Wonderful Life?
Yeah.
Like the older one? Like where the stars are the angels? That's probably where the star comes from.
I'm pretty sure this was before It's a Wonderful Life.
Yeah, but like that idea of like the stars or like the heavens are the angels like in space, and then the stars are sort of like angels. It's a weird.
Could also
it's
be
weird.
iconography for the Holy Spirit.
Yeah.
Being with the angel and speaking through the angel.
And the funny thing is like a lot of stars, when you see angels and stars, usually some angels in like the 50s, especially in the 50s, they'll have like stars on their like head dresses, and it's really weird. It's weird. I don't know.
I'm sorry. Art history minor Clark is having a little like party up in her brain.
Oh, no, it's fine. Like, it's a party. Everybody's invited. Everybody's invited. So, worship. There is one picture that every church has on their website that has to do with worship. Does anybody know what it is? What?
No.
Yeah, you did it.
Yeah.
That picture is on every church website. Like, okay, so if you saw some guy in your neighborhood in his front yard going like this, would you first think of worship? You'd think he was talking to aliens or something. This isn't worship. Well, not to me. Like, I see people in church do stuff like that, and that's fine. But like, this is so general. And then what I really hate is that what churches will do, what every church will do, is they'll have words that say like, we want to be more like Jesus. Jesus didn't stand out in the middle of a field with his arms out unless he was on a cross, but he didn't just do this in his free time. So it's like, I get it, but at the same time, get a job, man. Okay, here's the big one. This is the big mother of all images. Now, what is the one picture?
European white Jesus.
There we go. You usually see that guy. Yeah. Or if you were saved in like the past like 20 years and you're more progressive in your thinking, you see that guy. And I always attribute pictures of Jesus to that guy. This is Warner Solomon's Head of Christ. Every Southern grandma, old church that was made out of like pallet wood has this picture of Jesus. Everybody has seen this Jesus. And the thing is that in the 50s, in the late 40s actually, when the World War II was starting to come to an end, usually in times of crisis, America tends to turn to religion in times of crisis, and that's a universal thing. People turn to what they believe in times of great turmoil. And so, ironically, when America turned to religion, they thought about how to make money off of it. And so what they did is they hired an advertising consultant who would work on a lot of Coca-Cola stuff. You've seen Coca-Cola Santa Claus. It's not the same guy, but it's the same firm. And you can see it's like the same style. They were like, we need a picture of Jesus that we can bring to all these churches to use in their Sunday schools and stuff that we can sort of mass produce as like our Jesus, because people are getting religious and we want to put more stuff out. So this was the Jesus they came up with, and this is the most printed picture of Jesus in the entire world. You will see this in mud huts in India, like on a wall somewhere, and be like, how the heck did they get a picture of this Jesus there? By far the most influential picture of Jesus. And I think what's interesting is when I grew up in a very, very conscious of this family. And so I grew up seeing that guy. That's the Jesus of my childhood at our old church. That was the Jesus, and every time we went to church, they were like, hey, you have an afro just like Jesus. And I would go to white Christian school and see that guy, and then be like, I had a really messed up childhood. I'd see that guy at school, but then I'd go to church and see that guy, and I'd be like, okay, what's going on? So yeah. So how are we supposed to make sacred art? We're always going to have biases, we're always going to have our own ideas, we're always going to, we're going to get in the way of the picture. Like, how do we do that? And I think the one way that we can always make sacred art, or always make things about God, is to focus on having a goal in mind. And when I make art, I always want to have a purpose to where the image is portraying themes and stuff about the Bible that isn't sort of with an agenda behind it. Because a lot of those images were made with a sort of agenda behind it. Like, Jesus is white because that's who's in power. Or worship is just like this because we have to sell worship CDs. And that's what people do when we sell worship CDs. Or angels are women because the men in society right now are very aggressive. And, that's ugly. Like, we always have agenda behind it. And I think sometimes that works, and then sometimes it doesn't work, because sometimes that can lead people away from God. And we've seen it a lot of times where people are constantly painted these images of God or of these religious ideas, and it just turns them off to God completely. And so I take a lot of pride in being an artist or being a Christian imagery person. I don't know another way to say artist. But that I take really good pride in that, because that's a very important job. And so I know a very interesting thing about especially Protestants, not Catholics, but Protestants in particular, is that we have no visual culture whatsoever. And quickly, during the Reformation, when Martin Luther nailed his complaints, 99 problems, but the church ain't one, on the church in Wittenberg, and he
The church is one. Fighting on problems, and the church is one.
Well, not Jesus' church, just the
That's true.
established. They were really like, they were, and he did that because the church was corrupt at the time, and the church was really big on money. They really needed a lot of money to build a lot of the artwork that we see in Europe. And so what they would do is they would sell indulgences, which is the most famous reason, which is like a certificate that says, hey, you can go to heaven now because you gave me all your money. And then the least known reason why is because there was a lot of relics going around. And relics are things that come from Bible stories that people would hold dear. And so they'd be like, this is the bone of Thomas, Jesus' apostle. I think the weirdest relic, this is really weird, the weirdest relic was they used to sell bottles of milk. And they said that the milk came from the Virgin Mary. Isn't that weird? Like, why would you want that? They would just go around with these little tiny capsules, like tiny capsules of milk, and be like, "This is from the Virgin Mary." And it's like, how did you even get that? Like, that doesn't even make any sense. And so people would buy these things and like kiss them and like bow down to them and make shrines to them and stuff. And Martin Luther was like, "No, you need to be worshiping Jesus, because if that's what's getting in the way is these images and these things, then that's not okay. Like, we can't be doing that." So in a lot of Protestant culture, you'll see like no images or no pictures of anything. And we've been getting better about that. I think Elevation has definitely been doing their job in combating that with like all of their really cool graphics that I steal. I think like the most profound the most profound thing that Martin Luther said about all of that was there were these group called the iconoclasts. And the iconoclasts would go around Europe and they would graffiti churches and throw rocks in stained glass windows and cut the head off of statues because you're not supposed to have images. That was their whole thing. And Martin Luther said that instead of praising them, he said something along the lines of, why would you deface the crucifix that helps another man's faith? So if someone else comes to church and they are inspired by the image of Jesus on the cross, or like a stained glass window, and that reminds them of the goodness of God, why would you destroy that? And so in my own life, I recognize that I have, even though I'm not necessary, like you don't need to see a picture of Jesus to believe in him, I also realize that some people do need that imagery. Because ultimately, when you're imagining the divine or imagining the invisible, sometimes some people can't grasp that. So when we think of death, we usually think of this. We think of like a skull and crossbones, and it's dark, and that can scare people. But this is my favorite artist, Scott Erickson. I met him and I fangirled over him. But this is his version of death. And instead of seeing death as this goblin that comes to get you, or this thing about decay and all of this other stuff, because of Jesus, he's like, well, why are we doing that? We can always see death as just an awakening. All death is an awakening. All death is just opening your eyes to God. You leave this reality and you just enter God's. So it's nothing to be, this is a lot more approachable than this stuff. And when we do sacred art correctly, we see the Spirit. Everybody uses a dove because of the baptism narrative, and that's a really good image of, the sun arising, God speaking, and the Spirit descending. But this is my favorite one. Another artist I follow is Chris Cole, and he sees the Spirit as reading God's Word. And yeah, there's a dove, but it's done in a way where it's not just like, if someone just put a picture of a dove out there, they'd be like, what the heck are you talking about? This is more comprehensive than that. And this is my favorite one. When we do sacred art correctly, we can see God not as this. What is that? We don't see God as some old man in the sky who's just throwing lightning bolts at people because they turn gay, I don't know. But like, we see people as God. We see like a little piece of God in every single person that we see. Yeah. And I feel like that's very, very powerful. I know all of you have come into contact with people who see God like this. And then you go to church at Elevation or Refuge and you see people who see God as that. And there's like a huge difference. And I feel like to make that which is invisible visible is the whole goal of making sacred art. And so when you create things every week, or when you want to come up and show something, that is your initial goal, is to make that which is invisible visible. That's cool.
Yeah, Julius.